Hello friends, Jane Curcio back with Breaking Bread for You. And in this presentation, we are going to examine the life and legacy of perhaps the most beloved character in the Old Testament, Abraham, often referred to as Father Abraham, since he is the progenitor of both the Israelites and Gentiles of the ancient Near East, and those who descend from them. Although we have read the story of Abraham numerous times, most of us fail to fully appreciate this exemplary servant of God who was chosen by God to father a people for himself. And this particular people were meant to inhabit the world, to be a light in the world by revealing the true God of creation and his law. Although this background study on Abraham might seem academic to you, lacking theology, the study of God, I promise that it will tell more about God's nature, character, and plan to redeem lost humanity than anything we learn about Abraham. And about Abraham, I believe it is important for us to know just why God chose him above all others. It was Abraham who has the longest recorded conversation with God in the Bible, in which he negotiates saving Sodom from God's wrath in his effort to save his nephew Lot. Now, although many take Abraham to have been a Jew, he was not. He was a descendant of Noah through his son Shem, a Shemite Gentile from Ur of Chaldea, or Sumer, in southern Mesopotamia. His descendants were first called Jews, or Yudim in Hebrew, during the 6th century BC while exiled in Babylon, first mentioned in the book of Esther, 5th century BC. So we are going to begin with an examination of the culture from which Abram emerged to better understand him and the probable reasons God chose him, in particular, to father a nation for himself. Abram, pronounced Avram in Hebrew, was Abraham's birth name that means exalted father. He is introduced in the genealogy of Genesis 11 as the ninth descendant of Shem, Noah's son and successor. And although we often skip over or skim through long genealogies in the Bible, we need to appreciate that without them, the biblical narratives would lack historicity and be considered nothing more than fables. For this very reason, Matthew and Luke included the genealogies of Jesus in their Gospels. That said, let's begin with Abram's grandfather's lineage in chapter 11, verse 24, where it says, Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. And Terah's descendants are found beginning in verse 27, where it is reiterated that Terah begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Then it says, Haran begot Lot, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. And in verse 29 it says, Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, his niece, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren and she had no child. Notice here that in spite of the exactness of the record of Haran and his daughters Milcah and Iscah, Sarai's parentage is omitted. So ancient rabbis believe that Sarai was actually Haran's daughter Iscah, mentioned in verse 29, making her Avram's niece, as was Milcah's relationship to her husband Nahor. They base this idea on the genealogy of Rebekah in Genesis 22, where Milcah is said to have borne children with no mention of her sister Iscah. Yet later on, Avram does not tell Pharaoh that Sarai is his niece, but that she is his sister. And although we take it that Avram lied, it is plausible that he was actually telling the truth, since in that culture, men married their sisters and half sisters, particularly in the case of the upper class and royals, in order to keep the bloodlines pure. So it is plausible that the omission of Sarai's parentage, the most revered woman in Judaism, was to cover up her incestuous conception, later condemned in the law by the one who was under the law, Moses. And in verse 31, it continues to say, and Terah took his son Avram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Avram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, before we continue with Abraham's story, let's take a closer look at the culture in which he was raised to get a fuller picture of this patriarch and the probable reason God called him out of Sumer. In this frame is the map of Avram's journey from Ur and Sumer to Haran, where he and his household temporarily stayed, and from where Avram moved on to Canaan. The city-state of Ur of Chaldea is outlined in red at the bottom of the right-hand corner of this frame, with Haran outlined in red center top of the Fertile Crescent depicted in green. And the Fertile Crescent is just that, a lush area that extended from southern Mesopotamia into Canaan. This is a picture of God's goodness and why he chose it for his people to dwell in. Now, from what has been uncovered in the ruins of Sumer by archaeologists, we know that Avram did not come out of a backwater, but from a highly cultured society, referred to in the Bible as Ur of the Chaldeans, or Ur Kasdim in Hebrew. We also have learned that the Kasdim referred to themselves as the Sagigah, the black-headed people, and their territory as Kian-Geir, land of the civilized kings. But the Bible refers to that region as Shinar, Genesis 10:10, which comes from the Akkadian word for southern Mesopotamia, Shanha, from where we get Sumer. By the way, the place name Mesopotamia is taken from the Greco-Roman terms meso, meaning in between, and potamos, meaning rivers, namely the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia is now occupied by Iraq and Kuwait. Now, the Sumerians were a powerful people who had control over southern Mesopotamia for 2,000 years until 2004 BC, when Babylon seized power. And since Abraham lived during the 19th and 18th century BC, Babylonian control of the entire region would account for an easy passage from Sumer to Haran in the north. The Sumerians were a sophisticated people who are known for their innovations in commerce, government, technology, and language. Sumer's most impressive innovation is what may be the first writing system that initially used pictographs similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs shown in the box on the top left of this frame. Their pictographs developed into a wedge-shaped alphabet referred to as cuneiform, shown on the right. Using a sharpened reed, they would press into a clay tablet that would be baked to preserve the text, especially business accounting ledgers, but not school tablets that would be used over and over again. And the Sumerians developed a formal numbering system based on the units of 60. We still use units of 60 to divide time into hours, minutes, and seconds. Mathematicians concede that the Sumerians laid the groundwork for mathematical calculations of following civilizations. So we can say that Avram was literate, able to journal his experiences in Canaan, perhaps some of which we have in his narrative today. Otherwise, the events of his life would have been passed down orally from generation to generation until scribes recorded and preserved them. Other innovations of the Sumerians were in the hydraulic engineering, metallurgy, textile mills, and in the mass production of bricks, pottery, and statuary. The clay figurine on the left is of a man worshiping. Innovations in Sumer were driven by the lack of natural resources of trees, stone, and metal. In fact, clay was their plastic, used for just about everything, but mostly brick homes, walls, and vessels. In this frame is a section of a wall archaeologists uncovered in the ruins of Sumer, with the model on the right representing a typical Sumerian home. And although they may not have been the inventors of clay products, they were the first to mass produce them with such innovations as the pottery wheel. The Sumerians are considered to be the first to develop hydraulic engineering for harnessing the overflow from the Tigris and Euphrates to water crops and for the rich silt to fertilize them. They built dams using reeds, palm trunks, and mud, and made gates from reeds to control the water flow. The Sumerians are accredited with inventing the plow depicted in the model on the left and the two-wheel plow beneath it. Although they didn't invent the wheel, archaeologists maintain that they were the first to produce the four-wheel animal-driven chariot shown on the right. Many clay tablets have been recovered from Sumer that contain instructions on how to use the various types of plows they produced. And most of what we know about Sumer is taken from recovered clay tablets, as well as reliefs, like the one in this frame of a woman weaving on a loom. And it is from these artifacts that we know that the Sumerians were the first to produce fabric on an industrial scale. Unlike family-operated industries of the ancient Near East, the Sumerians established citizen labor organizations for mass-producing textiles and other products. The Sumerians were some of the earliest to produce products made from copper and bronze, such as spearheads, chisels, and razors. And the Sumerians were artisans, creating reliefs and sculptures and metals, such as this copper lintel. That all said, what can be said about Abram of Sumer? Well, although 90% of Sumerians were herdsmen and farmers, I take it that Avram was not. Yet he apparently became one in order to survive the journey from Sumer to Canaan and to sustain himself thereafter. And we know that Avram was a man of means, for when he left Ur, he had with him many servants, which farmers and herdsmen would not have had then. It is likely that he had acquired those servants, or slaves as they were, as war booty, as would be the case with military victors. If you will recall that Avram fearlessly rescued his nephew Lot, who had been kidnapped by King Chedorlaomer of Elam, chapters 13 and 14, with 318 of his own trained and armed servants, indicating that he had been in military leadership. Then can we say that being mighty in battle and defending his clan from enemy attack was one of the reasons God chose Avram to go and establish a nation in the land of promise? I think so. And if you will recall how Avram skillfully negotiated with God over not destroying Sodom, a skill he might have honed in government leadership, perhaps as a magistrate. Now, what do we learn about Avram from the religion of Sumer that he would have embraced or at least had been acquainted with? Sumerian religion was polytheistic, as was the case with most religions of the ancient world, having thousands of deities. Each city had its own patron god for whom they constructed the largest of shrines, the ziggurat. In addition, each family had their own favorite deity that they would venerate on altars, most often fertility gods. These personal gods were represented by clay figurines called teraphim in Hebrew, shown in this frame that were set in niches in the walls for good luck. And they were a superstitious people, the Sumerians. It was from Sumer that spilt salt was said to bring bad luck, and that tossing a pinch of salt over the shoulder canceled it out. Later, the Greeks and Romans who conquered Mesopotamia adopted that custom, which is how we know about it today. Now, their head god was An, the supreme ruler or father of all other gods. They believe had created the universe. And An had a wife named Kai, the goddess of the earth, from where we get Mother Earth. The goddess Nanu was An's and Kai's mother, who also produced Enlil, the god of the air, whose wife Ninlil was the air goddess. And the Sumerian sun god Utu was said to emerge from the doors of heaven each dawn to make his daily journey across the sky. Utu's father Nana was the moon god who trekked across the sky until dawn. So you can see that the Sumerian deities were personifications of nature, the basis of pagan religion. But then there was Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. She was the most revered deity since she was the life-giving goddess of reproduction and abundant harvests. She also ruled over political achievements and lordship, was the source of wisdom, understanding, and military victory, and ruled over judgment and decision-making. In Sumerian religion, mankind was inferior to these gods, thus could never reach heaven where they lived, in the sky and just above it. And not having any concept of salvation, the Sumerians believed that when they died, they would descend to the underworld called Ganzir, a dark and dreary place where they ate dust and debris that was ruled by the goddess of the dead, Ereshkigal. Also, the deities of the ancient Near East were thought to be territorial, having no power or authority over other regions. So what does this tell us about Avram? Well, if a new god was calling Avram to leave his homeland, he would have presumed that god to be the patron god of the country he was being sent to. And that was Canaan, whose creator god was El, whose son was Baal-Hadad, and wife Asherah. If you recall, those were the gods that the Israelites eventually worshipped. Now, the Canaanite name El was borrowed by the Israelites as a generic term for God, as we find in Genesis 14:18 with El Elyon, God Most High, the God of Melchizedek. And in Genesis 17:1, God names himself El Shaddai, God Almighty, while in Genesis 33:20, Jacob builds an altar to El Elohe, Israel, God, the God of Israel. Later, the name El for God transitioned to Elohim, the plural form of El, expressing not number, but superiority over the Canaanite El. And Avram's new God was not so easily satisfied as was believed of the Mesopotamian gods, who were appeased through flattery, cajoling, and humor. But Avram is commanded to do much more by his new God. Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Genesis 12:1. In the Hebrew, the command is lech lecha, go forth, an emphatic command for Avram to hurry out of Ur, leaving behind his family roots, his culture, and his religious beliefs and practices, not to mention the estate he would have inherited from Terah. And although the command to leave was abrupt, there is no hint in the text that Avram had been acquainted with God before he told him to leave Ur. So to have left Sumer and everything behind on a foreign god's command, it is likely that Avram was offered much more than what the Sumerian deities could, which in the end was a dreadful afterlife. So what did Avram's new God offer him that compelled him to obey? That answer is found in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3, where it says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Avram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Here we learn that Avram's new God is a personal God, unlike the head gods of Sumer, being more like the family gods venerated in the home. Yet his newly acquired God is far more than them, in that he speaks to Avram, promising him what the gods and goddesses of Sumer could never give him, the greatest assets of his culture. And they are great reputation, descendants, and land, a great deal of land, and nations of the world being blessed through him. But what he couldn't have known about nations blessed through him is that it would be fulfilled through the incarnation and sacrificial death of his new God's beloved Son that would reconcile sinners to God. The narrative continues in the second half of verse 4 of chapter 12, where it says, And Avram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. The city-state of Haran was a stopover from Terah and his household until he died, from where Avram continued on to Canaan, while Nahor remained behind. And in verse 5 it continues to say, Then Avram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, it says in verse 6, Avram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree, or oak tree, of Moreh. And the Canaanites were there in the land. And where it says the terebinth tree, it is not just any tree, but a Canaanite cultic site where an altar would be erected and deities venerated. But God isn't offended by that pagan site, who appears to Abram there to reinforce his promise of land, declaring to him, To your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Avram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Notice that wherever Avram's destination had been, he built an altar to his new God, the one who led him out from Sumer to Canaan, out from the worship of the false gods of the ancient Near East, of his family, to the worship of the one true God. And where it says in verse 8 that Avram called on the name of the Lord, that doesn't mean he knew God's name and called it out, but that he was evoking God's presence, and who he trusted was able to care for him and to fulfill his promises. The altars Abraham built were not only places of worship, but places of exchange, giving God what he required in worship and in obedience in exchange for God's grace. In doing so, Avram demonstrated a childlike faith and trust in this new God. This hugely contrasts to the one-sidedness of the religions of Sumer and Canaan. From his faithfulness and obedience to God's command to go to the land of promise, we later read in chapters 15 and 16 that God accounted it to him for righteousness. And the story of Avram continues in verse 10, where it says, Now there was a famine in the land, and Avram went down to Egypt to dwell there. For the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Here Sarah was 65 years of age, and still beautiful, evidently unusually so, for Avram to have feared that Pharaoh would take her into his harem. And in verse 12 it continues to say, Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So it was, when Avram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Avram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Now, we must first consider that although it looks like Avram lied here, in actuality, he might not have had it all, with Sarai actually being his sister or half-sister, as already suggested above. Yet, if he had lied, we can say that he did not trust God under the self-imposed threat of being killed over Sarai, and that he cared more about saving his own skin than his wife's, whose life would have been devastated, and Pharaoh's harem. But since God always sees to it that his plans are fulfilled, he comes to Avram's rescue, where it says in verse 17, But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Avram's wife. And Pharaoh called Avram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, She is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. However, could it be that Avram did trust in God to save the day, as it happened through inflicting plagues on Pharaoh's household? But if Avram had lied and was not trusting God here, this would reveal that he was fallible like us all, and that he is not the greater-than-life hero of the Old Testament we make him to be. But more importantly, it is to consider, what does this say about God? Does God have our backs when we get into trouble? Or can we say that his purpose in our lives and in the life of his church will not be foiled in the end? I think so. And this ends part 1 of the story of Abraham, Genesis 11 and 12. And I hope that you will return to review part 2 of this study. And may God bless you in every area of your lives as you study his word and apply it to your lives.